"You're too old for this, Grandpa. $500 says you can't even lift that crate off the ground." That's what the young recruit said to the 70-year-old man in the worn red jacket standing at the edge of the military training field. They laughed, pointing at the ammunition crate marked with yellow hazard tape, the kind that takes 2 strong men to move properly. The old man didn't respond. He just looked at the crate with those sad, serious eyes, his white beard catching the afternoon sun. The recruits kept laughing, slapping each other's backs, already counting their easy money. They had no idea who they were talking to. They saw only an old man who'd wandered onto the base, probably lost, probably confused. Common respect if you believe age doesn't define strength. The old man's name was Robert Mitchell, though nobody at the training facility knew that yet. He'd come to the base that morning for a scheduled appointment at the Veterans Affairs office, something routine about his benefits paperwork. The building was across the field from where the young soldiers were conducting their physical training exercises. Robert had taken a shortcut, his red jacket faded from years of wear, his white hair uncombed, his expression carrying the weight of decades. He looked like someone's grandfather who'd gotten turned around, not like someone who belonged among the sharp uniforms and parade ground precision. The recruits had spotted him immediately, and being young and full of themselves after a successful morning drill, they'd decided to have some fun. "Seriously, old-timer, you should head back to wherever you came from," one of them called out. A kid who couldn't have been more than 22. His uniform still crisp and new. "This is a military installation. We're training here." Robert had stopped walking, turned slowly to face them. His movements were deliberate, careful, the kind of movements that come from old injuries that never quite heal right. "I know what this is," he'd said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the distance. "I was just passing through." But the recruits weren't listening. They were looking at each other, that look young men get when they think they've found an opportunity to prove something. "Tell you what," the ringleader said, strutting over to one of the ammunition crates stacked near the supply truck. These weren't the heaviest ordnance, but they were substantial. 60 pounds of dead weight in an awkward metal container with minimal handholds. "You lift this crate, get it off the ground for 10 seconds, and we'll give you $500, cash, right now." He patted his wallet. "But when you can't do it, you admit you're just a confused old man who shouldn't be wandering around a military base." The other recruits howled with laughter. It seemed like the funniest thing in the world to them. Robert stood there for a long moment, his sad eyes moving from the young faces to the crate and back again. Something flickered across his expression, something the recruits were too young and too arrogant to recognize. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even offense. It was something closer to resignation, the look of a man who'd seen this kind of disrespect before and knew exactly where it came from. Ignorance, assumption, the belief that what you see on the surface tells you everything you need to know. $500, Robert repeated softly. "And all I have to do is lift that crate." The ringleader grinned. "For 10 seconds, clean lift, off the ground." He was already pulling out his phone to record what he assumed would be an embarrassing failure, something to share with his buddies later. Robert walked toward the crate, his gait slightly uneven, favouring his left leg the way he had for 40 years, ever since Khe-Sanh. The recruits didn't notice. They were too busy elbowing each other, making jokes, counting their money that wasn't going anywhere. Robert reached the crate, looked down at it, then did something that made a few of them stop laughing. He didn't bend down to test its weight or position his hands carefully or take a deep breath. He simply reached down with both hands, gripped the handles on either side, and lifted the crate smoothly off the ground. Not straining, not shaking. Just a clean, controlled lift that brought the 60-pound container to waist height. He held it there, steady as a rock, his face showing no more effort than if he were holding a bag of groceries. The seconds ticked by. 5, 7, 10. The recruits had gone quiet. Robert set the crate down gently, straightened up, and looked at the young man who'd made the bet. "That's 10 seconds, he said. Then, before anyone could respond, he walked over to a second crate, identical to the first, and lifted it with his other hand. Now he stood there, a 70-year-old man in a faded red jacket, holding 2 60-pound ammunition crates, one in each hand, arms extended slightly from his sides. His expression hadn't changed. Still sad, still serious, still carrying whatever weight he'd been carrying long before these kids were born. He held them there for another 10 seconds, then set them both down with the same careful control. The only sound was the distant flag snapping in the wind and the rumble of a truck somewhere on the far side of the base. "Jesus Christ," one of the recruits whispered. The ringleader's face had gone pale. His phone was still recording, but his hand had dropped to his side. "How did you... those crates are..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Robert brushed his hands off on his jacket. "I'll take that $500, he said quietly. "Not for me. There's a veterans' shelter in town that could use it." The young soldier fumbled for his wallet, but before he could pull out the cash, a voice cut across the training field like a whip crack. "What in God's name is going on here?" Everyone turned. A man in an officer's uniform was striding toward them, his face set in hard lines. He was older, maybe 50, with silver at his temples and enough ribbons on his chest to tell a story. The recruits snapped to attention immediately, their backs straight, their faces forward. The officer wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Robert. For a moment, nobody moved. The officer stopped about 10 feet away, his eyes locked on the old man in the red jacket. His expression went through a series of rapid changes: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like fear. "Sir," he said, and his voice had changed completely, all the command authority drained out of it, replaced by something that sounded like awe. "Sir, is that you?" Robert met his gaze, and for the first time something other than sadness flickered in his eyes. "Hello, Marcus," he said. "It's been a long time." The officer, Marcus, took 2 steps forward, then stopped again, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to get closer. "I didn't know you were... nobody told me you were on base today." The recruits were looking back and forth between the officer and the old man, trying to understand what was happening. The ringleader had gone from pale to grey. "Sir," he started, but Marcus held up a hand without looking at him, silencing him instantly. "Do you know who this is?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. The recruit said nothing. "This is Master Sergeant Robert Mitchell, retired. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 silver stars, a bronze star with valor, Purple Heart with 3 oak leaf clusters." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was shaking slightly. "Master Sergeant Mitchell carried wounded men out of a hot landing zone under enemy fire for 6 hours straight. 6 hours. He made 11 trips. The last man he carried out was me. I was 19 years old, and I had shrapnel in both legs, and I was bleeding out, and Master Sergeant Mitchell picked me up like I weighed nothing and ran through machine gun fire to get me to the medevac." The training field had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Marcus took another step forward. "He carried me and 3 other wounded men in that last trip because the helicopter couldn't wait any longer. He carried 4 grown men, 2 over his shoulders, 2 in his arms, across 200 meters of open ground while taking fire. The doctors said it was physically impossible. They said no human being could do what he did. But he did it anyway." Marcus's eyes were wet now. "He saved my life. He saved 43 lives that day, and he did it all while he was already wounded himself. He had a piece of shrapnel the size of my thumb in his leg, and he didn't even report it until after the last man was evacuated." Robert shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the attention. "That was a long time ago, Marcus," he said quietly. "Different life." But Marcus shook his head. "No, sir, not different. Same man, same strength." He turned to face the recruits, and now the command voice was back, hard as iron. "You bet this man couldn't lift an ammunition crate. This man could probably still carry every single one of you off this field if he had to. Not because he's stronger than you, though clearly he is, but because he's been tested in ways you can't even imagine, and he passed every test." He looked at the ringleader. "Give him the money, now. And then you're going to apologize, and then you're going to think very carefully about what you've learned today." The young soldier pulled out his wallet with shaking hands, counted out $500 in bills and held them out to Robert. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't mean..." Robert took the money, folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. "You didn't know because you didn't ask," he said. "You saw an old man in a worn-out jacket and you made assumptions. That's the lesson. Not about me. About how you look at people." He glanced at the other recruits, who were standing frozen at attention. "Every person you meet is carrying something you can't see. Every single one. Some people carry it better than others, but we're all carrying something. You want to be good soldiers? Learn to see past the surface. Learn to respect what you don't understand." Marcus stepped forward and, to everyone's surprise, saluted. It was a crisp, formal salute, the kind reserved for superior officers. Robert hesitated, then returned it, his movements slower, but no less precise. "Permission to escort you to your appointment, Master Sergeant," Marcus said. Robert almost smiled. "Almost?" "Granted, Lieutenant Colonel," he said, "though I remember when you were just a private who couldn't tell his left foot from his right." Now Marcus did smile, though his eyes were still shining. "You taught me the difference, sir. You taught me everything that mattered." They started walking together across the field, the officer and the old man in the red jacket, leaving the recruit standing in stunned silence. As they walked, Marcus spoke quietly. "I've been trying to find you for years, sir. I wanted to thank you properly. I wanted you to meet my family, my kids. I wanted them to know who you are, what you did." Robert shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Marcus. You did your job. I did mine. That's how it worked." But Marcus stopped walking, turned to face him. "No, sir. You did more than your job. You did what most men couldn't do, and you did it because that's who you are. That's who you've always been." He paused. "I'm a lieutenant colonel now because of what you taught me that day. Not just about courage, about what it means to never leave anyone behind, about what it means to keep going when everything in you wants to stop." Behind them, the recruits were still standing by the ammunition crates. The ringleader was staring at the crates like he was seeing them for the first time, understanding what it meant that an old man had lifted two of them like they were empty. One of the other recruits spoke quietly. "We really messed up." Another one nodded. "We judged him. We saw what we wanted to see." The ringleader picked up his phone, looked at the video he'd recorded, and then deleted it. "That money's going to the veterans' shelter," he said, "and we're going to volunteer there. This weekend, all of us." The others nodded. They understood now. They'd been taught something that no training exercise could have taught them. They'd learned what real strength looked like, and it didn't look anything like they'd expected. Robert finished his appointment at the Veterans Affairs Office, the paperwork that had brought him to the base in the first place. Marcus waited for him, and when Robert came out there was a small group gathered in the hallway. More officers, some enlisted personnel, all of them older, all of them with the same look in their eyes. They'd heard the story. They knew who he was. Some of them had served with him. Some had only heard the legends. They stood when he appeared, a spontaneous gesture of respect. Robert looked at them, at these men and women who wore their uniforms with pride, and for just a moment the sadness in his eyes lifted. Just a moment. Just enough to show that underneath all that weight he carried there was still the man who'd run through fire to save his brothers and sisters in arms. Marcus walked him to his car, an old sedan that had seen better days. "Sir," he said, as Robert reached for the door handle, "I meant what I said. I want you to meet my family. Please, let me do this." Robert looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the uniform and the rank to the scared 19-year-old kid he'd pulled out of hell all those years ago. "All right, Marcus," he said finally. "I'd like that." Marcus's face broke into a genuine smile. "Thank you, sir. Thank you." They shook hands, and then Marcus saluted again, holding it until Robert returned it. As Robert drove away, Marcus stood watching until the old sedan disappeared from view. He was still standing there when the recruits approached, led by the young man who'd made the bet. "Sir," the ringleader said, his voice formal and respectful now, "we'd like permission to organize a proper recognition ceremony for Master Sergeant Mitchell, something the whole base can attend, something that honors what he did." Marcus looked at the young soldier, saw something different in his face now, humility, understanding, growth. "Permission granted," he said, "but you'll do it right. You'll research his service record, you'll learn his story, you'll understand what you're honoring." The recruit nodded. "Yes, sir, we will, sir." Marcus watched them walk away, a small group of young soldiers who'd learned something today that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They'd learned that strength isn't always loud, that heroes don't always look like heroes, that the most powerful people are sometimes the quietest ones. That night Robert sat in his small apartment, the $500 on the table in front of him. He'd call the veterans' shelter in the morning, make the donation. But for now he just sat there in his red jacket, his white beard catching the lamplight, his expression sad and serious as always. He was thinking about Marcus, about that day 40 years ago, about all the days since then. He was thinking about the young recruits who'd learned a hard lesson today. He was thinking about all the weight he carried, all the memories, all the brothers and sisters he'd saved and the ones he couldn't save. The ones who never made it home. That's what the sadness was. What it had always been. Not weakness, not defeat. Just the weight of remembering, the weight of having lived when others didn't, the weight of carrying their stories forward because someone had to. Robert Mitchell would attend that ceremony the recruits organised. He would stand there in his red jacket while they read his citations and told his story. He would shake hands and accept thanks and try not to let the weight show too much, and then he would go back to his quiet life, his small apartment, his routine. Because that's what you did. You carried what you had to carry. You lifted what needed to be lifted. You kept going even when everything hurt. And sometimes, when young people forgot to look past the surface, when they forgot that every old person was once young and strong and tested by fire, you reminded them. Not with words, with action. 2 ammunition crates, 1 in each hand. As easy as breathing. As natural as the strength that never really leaves, that just changes form, that waits quiet and patient until the moment it's needed. That's the real lesson. Not that the old man was strong, but that strength takes many forms, and the most important kind is the strength that endures, that persists, that carries on long after the battles are over, and the uniforms are hung up, and the world has moved on to forget. Robert Mitchell remembered, and now those young recruits would remember too. They would carry that memory forward, pass it on, teach others to look deeper, to respect what they cannot see, to understand that every person they meet might be carrying 2 crates when everyone else assumed they couldn't carry one,